Join, on the other hand, today for this.
If you only watch Fox News, or for that matter, the liberal side of that, it's not going to be a healthy thing to do. So we talk about a good, healthy media diet where you have exposure to a wide variety of viewpoints.
This is On the Other Hand, a podcast that features community leaders in Arkansas sharing their views and experiences on how to make Arkansas better.
Welcome to the fourth and final part of this red-blue conversation that April and I have been having on the topic of free speech. April has been coming from a somewhat conservative stance while I have a more liberal take. Although the truth is, April and I both tend to have mostly similar views, which we've discovered as we've explored this topic. That common ground is often something we find when people are able to have extended civil conversations about their political views. We hope you've learned some things or had some preliminary assumptions about red and blue thinking challenged as a result of listening to April and me in this series. Now listen in as we finish our conversation, starting with a discussion of possible bias in media, as well as ways to ensure better balance in our consumption of political news.
Trump really complains a lot about that he did not get a fair shake from the media. Now, which media is he talking about? He's talking about the national level media that is the traditional media outlets. I think when he's talking about that.
I mean, what you say about like the three major networks, the legacy networks, I guess. Yeah, I accept the possibility that they have some liberal slant. The more important things, I think it's probably impossible for any source of media, no matter how well-meaning, to avoid some degree of, if nothing else, unconscious bias and perspective. But we're all human. I don't think we can hold people to those standards. Rather, we need to uphold them to standards of following what can generally be established as factual, and to have a variety of viewpoints so that you look at all parts of the elephant, and to say, okay, those three major networks are slanted, so I'm going to go to Fox News or OAN or whatever. That's just making the same mistake in the other direction. So, and I know you agree with me on this, but because this is some of the things we talk about, is if you want to have the best appreciation for the wide range of views politically and in terms of what's going on in this country, you need to have a good media diet. If the only thing you eat is cheeseburgers and candy bars, it is not going to be healthy for you. If you only watch Fox News or listen to whatever current version of Rush Limbaugh there is, or for that matter, the liberal side of that, it's not going to be a healthy thing to do. So we talk about a good, healthy media diet where you have exposure to a wide variety of viewpoints that cover the terrain there. Because my belief is that, and most people say this, that look at these things, every viewpoint has some element of truth to it. And if you only get exposed to one source, you're missing out an important part of reality. So the best decisions are made when we have access to all the various ways of looking at reality and all the different political perspectives. But you also have to include in that the importance of quality, relying upon quality news, trying to be unbiased and fair and factual as much as possible. You'll never get it to 100%. You don't need that. You just need to have a legitimate, sincere attempt to do as best you can, and then get exposed to a variety. That is a good media diet. So that's what we need to do, I believe.
I actually agree with that. And I'm actually,
Yeah.
when you were talking, I was pulling up the all sides
Yep.
media bias chart and just looking at that it changes over time. What is on the left and center and what's on the right. But they do have a really good allsides.com, an ability to look at a news story through the lens of the multiple perspectives. And so that gives you an idea. If you see a news story on something that's happened, let's just say the hurricanes that went through the middle part of the kind of eastern part of the U.S., Tennessee and Kentucky and Appalachian area. If you were to look at those news stories and how it was dealt with afterwards from allsides.com, you would see that they tell different stories. They focus on different things. So I think it is really important to have that balanced diet. But it's so easy to go back and eat cheeseburgers and candy bars. So Glenn, I like cheeseburgers and candy bars.
Yeah, feels good going down, doesn't it?
Yeah, tastes good.
But the body says eventually you're going to pay for it. And I
Yeah.
think ultimately we pay for it if we don't have a good media diet. Another piece of this, because you mentioned this earlier, and I think it brings up a good point. I think you were talking about this in reference to COVID, that, how do we know the accuracy of the scientific viewpoints and the information we get from the health experts? It's a legitimate point. People can say, well, I don't know that. I wasn't there. I didn't see it. And they're probably just doing that so they can get a grant. I understand how they can look at it that way. At some point, you have to make a reasonable decision about where you're going to get your information. Are you going to get your information from sources that are friendly to the industries that don't want to be regulated by government, or by people whose motivation is science and trying to establish what the facts are? Every person alive, including every scientist, clearly is an individual that has biases and problem areas. But the way science works is you have other people serving as a check on and a balance on that by doing other research, and it's a publicly done kind of thing. So ultimately, I think you have to look at science. And the other thing is, science is not just looking at one single study. It's looking at the preponderance of evidence over time, particularly if you take into account the quality of the research, because there's good research and junk research too. So I just think that's really important. So ultimately, if you hear a lot of scientists saying something, I think the smart move here is to pay attention to that. Continue to gather information, hear alternate arguments, sure. But if you just persist in believing what your side told you and dismiss everything that the vast majority of scientists say, and right now what comes to mind is climate change, then you're just making a mistake, and you're casting your lot with an element that has less of a likelihood of accessing accurate information.
As you were talking about this, I'm reminded of the unlikely friendship that has happened between a couple people that are connected with Braver Angels. One of them is Dr. Francis Collins, who actually was key in some of the work with COVID and vaccines, and in high up in kind of administration consulting in terms of what should happen with COVID. And he and Wilk Wilkinson, who's got a Derate the Hate podcast, who is very conservative, they have become friends over the years as they have learned to listen to each other about what went well and what went wrong during the COVID epidemic in terms of the way that things were communicated. So I'm looking right now. I typed in Braver Angels into YouTube and put in Wilk Wilkinson's name, and they have a Braver Angels Truth and Trust episode that they did that talks about their unlikely partnership, and what they learned from those days when it was so hard to be able to know who we could listen to and trust.
Yeah. One thing about that whole COVID period, there was a lot of criticism that I think was unfair toward the health experts, because they said, look, you told us to begin with we didn't need masks. Then you told us that we needed masks. I mean, you don't know what you're doing. Now, that's misunderstanding what's happening. What's happening is this was an unknown new disease, and the experts and the scientists were doing their best to figure it out. One of their first ideas was that maybe masks weren't, a particularly helpful tool, and then it was complicated by the fact that they were short of masks. But eventually, as they did more research and as more data came in, we became more familiar with what was happening with people who had the disease. We come to understand it better. And then we say, yes, in fact, masks do help. And we came up with more guidance that helped us limit the impact of the pandemic. That's the way science works. Science starts somewhere and you get more and more information, and it changes what you decide based on increasingly accurate and realistic appraisals of the situation. And I hear a lot of unfair criticism of the early phases of the pandemic and dealing with COVID, when that's all it was. We were doing the best we could with what we knew at the time. And then when we got more information, we changed our mind and said, okay, here's the new improved directions. Some people who either don't understand or don't care to consider how science works will then use that as evidence that we had malevolent people working, trying to control us as a society, which to me is kind of ridiculous.
And underneath the surface of that, which is not what we're going to be talking about because we're about out of time, Glenn.
Yeah, I know.
But it could be another conversation, is the whole managing of competing values of freedom and safety.
Good point.
And freedom being a huge thing for the conservative side of the house, of not being told what to do by government, and safety being a concern of the health officials.
The other thing I would add to that, freedom versus safety, those are competing values. Add to that the safety of that one individual you're affecting versus when it's something like a pandemic, an infectious agent that has the potential to affect, a vast population. Then it kind of changes the equation. I think that was part of the consideration too, that I think needs to be part of the discussion. Well, I know we're getting to where we need to stop, and I suspect we could go on for quite a bit longer, but there are a couple of things I wanted to make sure we get to. One is, the Supreme Court decision that equated money with speech. That's a biggie that we didn't get into, that I think needs to be mentioned. And I forget now what the name of the decision was by the Supreme Court, but it basically said that money is the equivalent of speech, so you cannot limit spending on political advocacy. And I understand their rationale for that. Here's the problem, in my view, and of many others, is that what that means then is that people in organizations that have money to spend have greater power than people who don't have the money. So their opinions can crowd out the opinions of others. To me, the analogy is, the old back when they founded this country, speech was standing on the corner and making a speech, or it was distributing pamphlets. Well, let's take the standing on the corner in the public park and making a speech. Now, what if, we have one person wanting to make their point, who are standing there speaking, and then someone else comes along with a big bullhorn and huge speakers and totally drowns out the other person where they can't say anything. To me, that's the equivalent of that Supreme Court decision that money equals speech, is that it allows that unfair advantage. So that's one thought.
Glenn, that's that I think a United Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission back in 2010. I don't know where the conservatives stand on this because I haven't studied that, but I will say that I don't like widening the definition of free speech to include material support. That I don't get that connection.
Well, it also made it, I don't know if it's the same one or different, but it says corporations are people. So corporations can spend money and advocate. Some of this is kind of downright silly. But it's the Supreme Court has ruled. So eventually, hopefully, some of this will be overturned, but some of the things get really, really bizarre.
I will tell you this, and I know that this is another whole issue, but whether the Supreme Court should be able to legislate morality, or can we even legislate morality? You know, should the Supreme Court be actually creating laws from the bench?
They probably say they don't, but
I would think
but
they
they,
say they don't, but a lot of people think they do and that they should.
my opinion would be that courts should not make laws, and I don't think they do, but they have the impact of laws if they issue, as they're supposed to do, issue an opinion on the constitutionality of different laws, and so that has the impact of changing the law. But there's a way, our checks and balances system has a way to address that. If you don't like what the Supreme Court decided about what is and is not legal or constitutional, you change the law if the law does it. And if it reaches the point where you have to change the Constitution, you pass a constitutional amendment. That's just the system we've got to work with. It may be imperfect, but that's what we've got to work with.
Same with executive orders, right? If you don't like those executive orders, then don't put them into law. Then it'll go back the next, if we have a different, president, the new executive orders will take over those executive orders. But if you want it, you think it's important enough, then it's got to be made into law.
Absolutely.
But then the Supreme Court decides how it, or courts decide how that law will be interpreted and applied.
Yeah. Okay. There are a lot of other things we could talk about. I guess we are all to stop now. So, but I really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation. It's been fun, and I'm not sure how many differences we had, but I did hear some perspectives from the conservative standpoint that I appreciated your being the voice for that.
So I want to just kind of end with some ending thoughts here and give you a chance to do that as well.
Okay.
Glenn, just kind of wrap things up as we're thinking about this. I near the beginning said that I was more of an Aristotelian virtue ethics person, right, in terms of free speech. And Aristotle talks about a virtuous mean, right, with his virtues. And the recognition is there that we can go into excess and we can have deficiencies. So, for example, courage, we have a virtuous mean of speaking with moral courage, right? Speaking the truth, even when it's unpopular or risky. But the excess is that we're reckless, that we are using inflammatory or harmful speech, right? So in the middle is this speaking with moral courage. You've got excess on one end, and then you've got deficiency. We can also self-censor out of fear. We can be a coward, right? Take, truthfulness is another example. So we can, the virtuous mean might be that having honest expression that's rooted in our personal values and integrity. We're accurate in our speech. We're not exaggerating. We're not being deceitful. The excess on that is brutal honesty that lacks concern for the other, like kind of obnoxious aggression. But the deficiency can be, I am dishonest, or I'm manipulative or insincere, I'm evasive. So when we're thinking about aiming towards this virtuous free speech, I have to recognize in myself personally that I have some responsibility to uphold my ethical values and my concern for others when I'm speaking out. Sometimes I'm going to be called to call out some behavior or person, maybe in a public setting. I don't like doing that because I'd rather call them out personally and maybe have a relationship. But there might be a time in which I need to block a behavior, something that's harming a group of people, and work together with others to do that. There are other times in which I need to call into relationship people who are different than us. So emphasizing that bridging connection that we often have in Braver Angels. But that's not always the choice that I need to make. So recognizing that civility, when we're thinking about virtuous free speech, can be strong civility. and courage and speaking out, even when it's unpopular or risky. But we can do that without descending into that recklessness or lack of concern for others. And that's what I personally try to aim towards, and what I wish others, all others, would do in recognizing the dignity of the human beings that we are dealing with on an everyday basis.
Very well said. Thank you. I guess my kind of concluding remarks would mirror somewhat what you've had to say. I really appreciate the idea of the courageousness that's required sometimes to speak out, and for that matter, to even advocate for positive moral reasoning, because it goes against what some people want. So I appreciate that. To me, when it comes to free speech, I, you know, there's the legal and the moral. I recognize you have the legal right in some ways, but always remember the responsibility you have with these rights, and try to maintain a moral stance in what you say. So even if you speak, you may decide, I could legally speak out. Morally, I don't think it's the right thing to do. Or you could say, I need to speak out, but there are choices I have to make about how I say it. And so the morality once again comes in. So a lot of this is just saying based on a moral standpoint that I wish more people would think about. The thing that you got at, the relationship, is just so important, is to always be working on what can you do to nurture a positive relationship with someone who has a different opinion. You're more likely to get somewhere with them that way. Um, let me just move on here. I had a thought that I'm going to just drop. Another area of concern is how much we tend to get dug into our viewpoint and aren't willing to look at ourselves, lacking self-awareness and being able to self-criticize, and being open to changing if we realize we were believing something or doing something based on wrong information or a bad perspective. So always be open to being passionate about your beliefs, but looking at where you might be willing to change and hear other people if it looks like you're going in the wrong direction. Recognize the need to consider not only your own individual or others' individual rights. That's one thing we're known for in the West in general, in America in particular, freedom, individual freedom. There is also a responsibility, and this was talked about by some of our founders, the importance not only of individual, but also of the importance of the community, of having a regard for what's best for the community, the people. So recognize the need to think about for the good of the group as well as the good of the individual, and that has to be balanced. And then finally, I guess I would encourage you to think about whatever you do in terms of your speech or your behavior or your interactions with others, focus on the positive, being as positive as you can. So if you have a choice between criticizing someone by calling them names and making fun of their political hero or something, that's not being a very positive way. Be positive in terms of saying, here's what I think and why, and I think this is, why this is a good way to look at it. I have these disagreements with you here, but don't be disagreeable with that person. You could kind of, in a way, it all comes down to something that two big influences in my life: Jesus and the Beatles. They both talked about love, right? And if you get it all down to the positive, the other stuff, it all comes down to love. So I'll just leave it at that.
It all comes down to love. Yes, certainly. And the love that leads us to interact with others in principled and respectful ways.
Yes. Yes.
This has been fun, Glenn. I think that we probably recognize, and not surprisingly, that we have a lot of things in common in terms of free speech. And I hope that others who are listening can think about ways that they might differ from us, or that they might have things in common. we love actually to have guests on our show. So if some folks who are doing work in the community would like to come on and talk to us, they can certainly reach out as well
Yeah.
to give us their ideas.
And I agree. I was about to say something very similar, that I think we have an email that I would like to give people in case they're interested in coming on the show, or they know someone who would be good, or they just have a suggestion for a topic if they like what we're doing and want to hear more of this. But I think it'd be good if we get other people besides just me and you. But it's a start. So the email address to contact us is otherhandar, no spaces, otherhandar, AR for Arkansas, right? Otherhandar@gmail.com. So email us if you have any ideas for topics or guests who might want to talk about some of this. I'd like to do some more of this, and we'll go from there. But thank you so much for listening to April and I, and we'll see you next time around.
Well, that's it for our final part of April and Glen's red-blue conversation with each other about free speech. Remember that On the Other Hand offers dozens of other interviews like this one, and you can find them inside your favorite podcast app or on the podcast page at arkansas.braverangels.org. On the Other Hand is sponsored by Braver Angels in Arkansas. Music was composed by Randall Standridge of Jonesboro, Arkansas, and was performed by the University of Northern Colorado Symphonic Band, Dr. Richard Main, conductor.
I'm your host, Glenn White.
And April Chatham Carpenter.
Join us in working to make our relationships and communities better.